Ready, Niharika.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this dialogue today, which we hope will have some powerful outcomes on issues related to decolonization of knowledge. So to begin with, I just want to say that the organizers of the Third World Conference of Virtual Transdisciplinarity, the CRET France, INA Mexico, CTU Italy, CTRANS Brazil, have made this global event of great importance for us all. This Congress is part of the Third World Congress of Face-to-Face Transdisciplinarity that will be held in Mexico City from October 31st to November 8, 2022. After 15 years of the Second World Congress in Brazil in 2005, the objectives of the Third World Conference of Transdisciplinarity in the virtual and the face-to-face modality are to bring together the largest number of participants from various national and international institutions to address the latest theoretical developments and practices of transdisciplinarity and propose new approaches and experiences to face the extraordinary challenges of the 21st century, such as terrestrial civilization, sustainable development, health, gender equality, poverty, the destruction of biological diversity, climate change, in the context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in the broader context of COVID-19. So at today's session on decolonizing knowledge systems, I urge you all to actively participate as contributors to this event. We will have a question answer round in the end. Well, not in the end, it'll be a core part of this session. And I would urge you all to actively contribute, ask questions, and discuss your ideas and thoughts to help us spread the Congress in your networks to achieve the best results in this global dialogue for the continuing hope for the future on our planet. So with these few words, I will call upon our first speaker who will set the stage for this dialogue. Dr. Rajesh Tandon, founder, president of Participatory Research in Asia and co-chair of the UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. Dr. Tandon is a leader and practitioner of participatory research and development, a pioneer of participatory research. He has given new meaning to academic research by redefining the relationship between the researcher and the researched. So welcome, Dr. Tandon.
Good evening to you all. Thank you, Niharika. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, colleagues from around the world. I am based here in New Delhi, in India. And I am experiencing, just as all of you are experiencing, a feeling of hope and uncertainty, both together at this juncture. And in this feeling, it is being intensified partly from the experience of the pandemic. Almost all of us around the world have lost some loved ones. Many have been quite unwell. And one can think that this could have been prevented or the loss could have been minimized. I am also quite acutely aware of the continued disruptions in our lives and livelihoods arising out of the severe impacts of climate change. Floods, droughts, cyclones are causing dislocations, are causing evictions, and large number of people are being affected. What the COVID demonstrated to us, the pandemic demonstrated to us in each of our countries, is what we knew intellectually and academically before, that the world has become highly unequal. In fact, during this 18 months of the pandemic, it became even more unequal. I have been working with issues that affect the marginalized and the poor in my region for 40 years, 40 plus years. And I have never seen such desperation, such hopelessness among them who are informal workers, construction labor, domestic maids, landless agriculture, peasants, as we are witnessing today. And in the face of it, we have also learned how formal education is continuing online as if nothing has changed. And it is to this particular problematic that today's panel will be speaking to you. We will bring to you our experiences and perspectives on why it is important and urgent at this moment to decolonize the knowledge production, dissemination, and communication system which we have built nearly 500 years ago. In today's world, knowledge has become an exchange commodity. We have become experts in knowledge economy. And most of us who are in academia, in universities, in research systems are actually higher end of the knowledge workers. So, I would like to therefore share with you how we as UNESCO chair have been attempting to push the envelope, push the agenda of decolonization in the higher education system around the world. And I'm going to request my colleague Niharika and Marco to put up that PowerPoint so that I can take you through this. And I want you to be active in this conversation because we cannot have a conversation on decolonization which is not related to our context. And that context at some level is similar around the world, but also locally different. One of the first things that the pandemic taught us is that national and global supply chains, when they are thoroughly disrupted, as they were, communities and families depended on themselves, their neighbors, and their social networks. It shows the resilience of those networks on the one hand, and also demonstrates the fragility of these models of global supply chains where food is produced in one part of the world and shipped out to another part. Thank God that we have small farmers and communities around the world which produce their own food and look after their own water so that they could survive the 18 months of the pandemic and have not died out of hunger. Desperation, yes. Loss of nutrition, yes, but not mass-scale famine or hunger, because local capacity, local efforts, and local knowledge was deployed in all our communities around the world. So, next slide, please. As UNESCO chair in community-based research and social responsibility, At this particular juncture, in this period of post-pandemic, it is a very interesting development that Bud Hall and I produced, edited a book which has come out, and it is called Socially Responsible Higher Education, International Perspectives on Knowledge Democracy. The book has case studies from 17 countries. There are 45 authors, and it is open access. It is free access. You can download it where it is there. And I would request Marco to distribute this to all of you from the conference materials. And I invite you to take a look at this book. By making it open access and free, we are fulfilling a major responsibility of socially responsible higher education. Because knowledge production from higher education institutions over the last 50 years or so has become increasingly priced out, inaccessible to many practitioners around the world and many researchers in the global south. If this book was priced, it would have cost $35 or 25 pounds or 30 euros. And for many young researchers in global south, this would have been impossible to access. This, for me, is one of the pivotal aspects of being socially responsible and making knowledge democratically available. Next slide, please. You are familiar with this. I don't need to repeat all this. But the report of the IPCC now is creating serious pressure on us. In a couple of months, COP26 will take place and in Glasgow. And we are still discussing whether financing for adaptation and resilience, which was committed more than 6 years ago, is going to be made available or not. On the other hand, many knowledge producers in the field of geology and technology are supporting, and banking, finance industry are supporting continued investment in fossil fuels, continued investment in technologies and manufacturing units, which have been at the source of this. Part of the challenge, therefore, for higher education institutions is to frontally question those who continue to make money out of perpetuating climate disasters, where the effect is most severely felt by the poor and the vulnerable. As you can see in this picture, all your countries have similar photographs and similar experiences around the world. Next slide, please. Now, I want to tell you about a particular strategy that UNESCO chair have been using. And several of you perhaps heard my colleague, Dr. Bud Hall, yesterday, day before yesterday. We realized that it is important that academics, university-based researchers, and especially their next generation of young researchers acknowledge that academia is not the only site of knowledge production. For centuries, and time immemorial, communities, farmers, workers, families, grandmothers have struggled to produce solutions which work for them locally. In those days, they may not have systematically recorded them, but they knew and they passed them on orally. Sites of knowledge production exist outside the academia and the research world, and they are linked to indigenous knowledge, experiential knowledge, practical knowledge, knowledge in action, knowledge for use, and a knowledge coming from the subaltern part of our societies. Knowledge from the lives of the workers, the peasants, the women, domestic workers. This knowledge continued to be dismissed and devalued in the past. Only during the pandemic, we began to realize the value of this knowledge. And now, in the face of the climate change, many people have begun to talk about how important it is to value what our indigenous communities knew and how they treated the natural habitation. Their relationship to ecology was one of cohabitation and coexistence, not of exploitation and accumulation. So, with this perspective, we began to think about ways in which a new generation of young researchers can be sensitized, and they can then be motivated and trained to be able to work together with local communities to produce knowledge which is actionable and which can take local experiences and local problems at the center of their research. So, Knowledge for Change Consortium builds on creating partnerships between the world of academia and the world of practice. Partnerships between researchers based in higher education institutions and researchers working in the communities in everyday life who are not labeled or certified officially as researchers, but in fact are knowledge keepers, knowledge producers, and knowledge communicators. So the fundamental premise of this knowledge for change strategy is that knowledge exists in multiple sites, knowledge is produced through struggle, knowledge is carried forward through oral tradition and everyday experience, and knowledge is embedded in the lives and cultures of indigenous communities of all our societies. So, Knowledge for Change, therefore, is an attempt to create partnerships, which we call KFORC hubs. Partnership between an academic research institution and a community organization, sets of community organizations, and they work together on locally relevant research questions, locally prioritized sustainable development goals, and locally emerging climate adaptation and resilience questions in local communities. So the purpose of the hub is to build the capacity to work together in partnership research to find knowledge solutions to local challenges arising out of the pandemic and the climate impacts. And in this process, we are encouraging these partnerships to learn to value local knowledge, learn to prioritize local research questions, and learn to work in partnership with local actors and support them in improving the conditions of their context. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, And there are some links in this you can read and see that essentially this is a global network, a global consortium of local hubs. Each K4C hub is locally rooted, and they together get trained in use of community-based research in the philosophical and normative aspects of knowledge democracy and the methods that will support decolonization of the theoretical frameworks and methodological tools. And in the process, they learn to work together, and then each hub continues its capacity building program for the next generation of researchers drawn from the world of academia as well as from the world of practice. And these next generation of researchers then continue to produce knowledge which is locally relevant, locally actionable, and locally owned. Next slide, please. So you can see that there is a journey of how K4C hubs have begun. We started in 2018 and the 2019, 20, 21. Despite the pandemic and our inability to do a face-to-face residency, we have continued with online, working together, training a next generation of mentors who in turn become the central organizers of each hub. Next slide, please. So you can see now we have 22 hubs, we have 120 trained mentors, about 30 of them drawn from community organizations in 14 countries around the world. And the network among them selects issues which cross-fertilize their experience. I'm delighted that you will have the possibility of hearing from two of our K4C hubs, the one located in Gulu in northern Uganda and another located in Tkaronto in Canada, later in this session. Next slide, please. These are some of the links for reading resources, etc. But I think, Marco, you can take it down and send it to people who are attending the session and those who want to get access to it. And I just want to make one or two closing comments before handing over to Niharika back again. I feel it is important that we revisit the public purpose of knowledge, that we revisit its public accountability, and we revisit the link between knowledge democracy and decolonization, particularly from the vantage point of those who have been excluded, marginalized, and unable to gain access, whose knowledge has been devalued and whose perspectives in life have been rejected. Because it is these people, it is the marginalized communities, small peasants and indigenous communities, which are actually still protecting our ecology, our biodiversity. Because the rest of us who have been highly trained as professionals are actually consuming that ecology and diversity. We are actually the source of the problem, not small peasants and indigenous communities. So their knowledge and their perspective and their way of sharing knowledge needs to be revalued. Thank you very much. And I hand it over back to you, Niharika.
Thank you so much, sir. That was very, very enlightening, and you made some very relevant points to emphasize the importance and the urgency of decolonizing knowledge. its production, communication, and the systems of communication, the idea of socially responsible higher education, and how, in terms of climate change, higher education can play such an important role in questioning those who perpetuate these climate disasters. And finally, speaking of the Knowledge for Change Global Consortium, its uniqueness in supporting locally and contextually relevant knowledge solutions. And finally, the marginalized and their voices and how important their knowledge is. So thank you so much for those points. And with that, I'm going to move on I'm just going to check if Professor Openjuru has been able to, yes, I can see him. So I'm going to introduce him. We have with us our second speaker, Professor George Openjuru, who is currently the Vice Chancellor and Professor of Education at Gulu University. He was formerly Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic Affairs at Gulu University, and Dean, School of Distance and Lifelong Learning for the College of Education and External Studies at Makerere University. His area of specialization and research is adult literacy, education, and lifelong learning. So, Professor Openjuru, the floor is yours.
Thank
Professor, we can't hear you. There's a slight connectivity issue.
Thank you so much. I hope I'd like to thank you for. Are you getting me? I'm hearing you very clearly.
No, it's getting cut in the middle, Professor.
Am I
All right. I'll just give another few seconds in case Professor Openjuru can maybe. Okay, maybe Professor Openjuru, if you can log back in, and until then, we can move on to our next speaker.
Okay, am I clear now? I am getting. I am getting.
Yes.
It's okay. I can see you and hear me. I am hearing you. I think maybe you can even see me. Can you see me? Hello? Hello? Sorry. Hello? Hello?
George,
Hello?
we could
Hello?
see
Hello?
you briefly. Good evening, George. We could see you briefly. Rajesh,
yeah, but I'm hearing you very clearly.
But your voice is not coming.
You very clearly.
Your voice is not coming clearly. There is a disruption. So what I am suggesting to you, what Niharika was suggesting, is that you log out just now, and after a while, 5 minutes, log back in, because that sometimes improves the quality. And in the meanwhile, Niharika may invite the next speaker, and then she will invite you. Will that be okay, George? Okay, go ahead, Niharika.
All right. All right. So our next speaker is Madam Silvia Schmelkes, Vice Chancellor of Iberoamericana University in Mexico. She is an educational researcher since 1970. She has published more than 150 articles, chapters, books on the quality of education, adult education, values education, and intercultural education. She founded and was General Coordinator for Intercultural and Bilingual Education in the Education Ministry in Mexico. We're very honored to have you, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from wherever you are listening to us. And I thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity of sharing with you my ideas on the transformation of higher education. Let me see if I can. Seems I can't. Can you see it there?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Well, thank you very much. So I have titled my participation as Complexity and Transdisciplinarity in University Formation and Research, a Needed Transition. And to begin the presentation, I would like to show this slide that puts into context what I want to say. The first thing that I want to say is that, as Professor Rajesh was saying, we are now in the midst of a change of paradigm, where we are very much aware of the fact that we are a diverse population. And not only are we aware of that, but we are learning to value diversity. So that is something that is happening in the world today in this change of paradigm. The other thing that is changing is that also we are very much aware that problems are complex and that the way that we have been approaching the solution to these problems is not working anymore, that we need to change that way of dealing with complexity. And finally, uncertainty and the changing world, the way the world is changing, the fact that we cannot plan for the long term, and the need to be able to develop capacities and abilities to adapt to changes continuously and to even lead these changes that are in the midst of uncertainty. But also we have an enormous amount of social and environmental problems, as was already discussed. And of course, the two, as Pope Francis has told us, are entirely related. Social problems and environmental problems are part of the same thing, no? But among the problems that I think we have to emphasize are the fact that we have inequity and a growing inequity, also as a consequence of COVID. Poverty and hunger that are a consequence of inequity. They are not a problem in themselves, they are a consequence of a greater problem, which is inequity. We also have discrimination and racism, which is a problem that does not allow many people to thrive and to grow. And we have the question of human mobility, which shouldn't be a problem either, but it becomes a problem when there is racism or xenophobia, or when countries are not being able to receive the people that are moving to their countries from other countries, like we are experiencing in Mexico right now with people migrating towards the United States from Central America, and Mexico is not receiving them well at all. You know? And on the side of environment, well, this has already been mentioned, there's climate change, there's pollution, and of course, there is the loss of biodiversity. And well, the universities have to be engaged and have to be responsive, both to the change of paradigm and to these problems that our world is facing today and that the majority of the populations are facing today. And the universities are, of course, not alone. They are one of many actors. The government is there, social organizations are there, non-governmental organizations are also there, civil society organizations. But the universities have to partner with all of these institutions in order to be able to really get involved in the transformation of the world around us, social problems and the environment and the relationship between the two. So this is the greater context of what I want to participate today, or to share with you today. One of the things that I want to say is that before these ideas of how to be responsive in a different manner from the universities to these problems were marginal, and they were alternative, and they were not well understood. And this is in a great part still so, but there is a movement towards making these ideas more and more trending. And well, I think UNESCO chair that Bud Hall and Professor Rajesh are leading is an example of this. It is not the only example, but it is a clear example. But of course, what we need are responsive higher education institutions to all of these problems and to this change of paradigm. And for that, we need approaches that are inter and transdisciplinary. We need to foster epistemological dialogues. We have to be open to others and to other ways of knowing. And as universities and higher education institutions, we need to have much more presence in communities, in policymaking, and in society at large. And there are two very, very recent documents. One of them is not out yet, and I have been working on it. But there's the UNESCO Futures of Higher Education that is already approaching, dealing with these approaches. And there's an expert group on higher education institutions that is working on the document for the World Conference on Higher Education that is to take place in Barcelona in May of next year. That is called Knowledge for Action, that is about to come out, and that it also deals very clearly with all of these questions. I think we should be aware that the progress towards this change of paradigm and towards this responsiveness of higher education institutions is not linear. That the higher education institutions are very diverse because their contexts are diverse, and they are finding diverse roots. And I think this is good. This is good in this object of valuing diversity. And also we have new institutions, some institutions that are organized for transdisciplinary activity, but we also have intercultural universities. In the case of Latin America, they have thrived in the last decade. And we even have subversive universities, universities that are not asking for degrees, but that are dealing with very, very profound epistemological dialogues, or with the systematization and the formation in other ways of knowing. And there are many examples of those in my region, at least recently. So this has to do with the three traditional functions of higher education institutions, which are, of course, education, research, and outreach. And in the case of education, well, I think the things that are happening, and here I'm going to give us an example of what we are doing at Iberoamericana University. First of all, I think it is necessary to transversalize some core themes, and to make sure that all students in any program has the possibility and the opportunity of learning about these core themes. And for us, these three core themes have been interculturality, which has to do, of course, with racism, which is the way to educate against racism and against discrimination, with gender issues, which are very much a problem in our society recently, and of course, with sustainability and sustainable development. So transversalization, I think, is one of the ways we have to respond to this new paradigm. Also, I think we need an interdisciplinary approach to all subject matter, or at least all subject matter that is prone to having an interdisciplinary approach. That I think that we should have many more subject matters that are problem-based with an interdisciplinary approach to the analysis and the understanding of these problems. Also, we are designing transdisciplinary study programs already, programs that are not, that don't come from the disciplines. Some of them are graduate programs, but not all of them. Some of them are even undergraduate programs. And the ones that we are working on right now have to do with inequality, studies of inequality. And this is something that is being carried out by, of course, the Department of Economy, but with many other departments like the Department of Social Science, but also of Migration and also of Law, that are involved in developing this program. We have a program on critical gender studies that also is very interdisciplinary, that there are 14 different departments of the institution participating in this. It's a PhD on critical gender studies, and it already has one generation that is coming out of this program. Then we have one on migration, because the case of my country, we have migration of our own, internal migration, which is very important, from the very poor areas to the very rich agricultural areas, and it becomes a problem. But we also have the return migration, forced return migration from the United States, and we have the migration that comes from the South that crosses our country to go to the United States, and this becomes a problem. So we have to deal with it also interdisciplinarily. And there's a program on peace and governance, because violence also in our country is something that is very, very problematic, mainly criminal violence, criminal organizations. Of course, sustainability, and this is something that actually our university began with a program of sustainability at the pre-graduate level. And of course, here the approach has always been socio-ecological, and now we are enriching it with further disciplines, with other disciplines. Cities is another important theme that we are developing a program on that has to do with design of sustainable, inclusive, equitable, and educational urban regions, taking into account that already 70 or 80% of our populations in Latin America are now urban already. And then we have another one on territorial studies that has to do with all disciplines, and that mainly deals with those areas in which mega development projects are going on and are affecting very gravely an important percentage of the population, and mainly indigenous population in those regions. Also, we have a program on social formation. All of our students have now, with a new change of plans, all of our students need to go through a trajectory to be formed socially. First, there is a first contact with those who suffer the consequences of social and/or ecological problems. And this first contact leads to understanding the problem, to critical thinking, and to indignation. Freire talked about the pedagogy of indignation, and to indignation because of the injustices that they are suffering. Then we have the learning through dialogue with those who suffer the problems, and the practice of transforming reality, where students are able to relate theory and practice, to put what they are learning regarding their own discipline in practice towards the solution of a problem with others of other disciplines. We have, of course, this is always reflexive action, action that is then theorized and reflected upon and improved thanks to that reflection. And also we relate research with education and transformative action. We consider that education is something that is the consequence, or can be the consequence, of participating in research at all levels of education, even at the pre-graduate level. And of course, there are other things that we have to deal with, and I think that this is something that we are just beginning to do, but the teaching of local languages, which we think is very important, because as we know, indigenous languages in the world are being lost, and universities traditionally have not dealt with the languages of their own countries. So this is something that we think we should be doing. We have to not only teach local languages, but teach in local languages to be able to include indigenous populations in our communities. Also, the epistemological dialogue in classroom, and this is more and more possible when we have a more diverse population, and this is something that we should strive for. And participation in academic and institutional affairs on the part of students and also of teachers, so that democracy is also something that is experienced in all areas of university life. And well, of course, we are also participating in KFORC, and we have a first generation of professors that have gone through a training program, and we are going to begin a hub in KFORC, which Professor Rajesh was explaining. In the case of research, well, in research, we are trying to emphasize understanding and contributing to solve problems that affect communities and society at large. We know that we have to overcome these dichotomies that are false dichotomies between basic and applied research, for example, because they are very, very closely related, and we have to make that evident. We have to move towards centered transdisciplinary research with the participation of communities representing other ways of knowing. This is very important, and this is what makes our research transdisciplinary. We have to be open and to dialogue with non-scientific knowledge and with other ways of knowing, and also with the knowledge that is accumulated by those who are suffering the consequences of social and ecological problems. We also think there is a need to refine the methodologies and to struggle for the acceptance of subversive research approaches such as participatory action research or community-based research. We also have to move towards the acceptance that knowledge is also generated through intervention and through transformation, and we have to include research in our transformation endeavors. Of course, open science is very important, and a wide dissemination of generated knowledge and solutions. This goes against individualistic and elitist publication criteria, which are now still dominant in our universities. We have to strengthen research networks with other higher education institutions, and we have to do research for and with communities and society, both locally and globally. And of course, research has to have a very close relationship to education. And finally, outreach. Here we need to involve the university much more with all sectors of society, not only with the traditional sectors with which universities have been related to. No, we have to relate to communities, to civil society organization. We have to relate the universities with social movements, with the private sector, and with the government. The universities have to play a role in advocacy, and they have to have a say in public policies and the design of public policies and in the evaluation of public policies. We need a wide diffusion of the knowledge that is generated and the solutions that are generated as a consequence of interventions for transformation. So we need to participate in intervention projects. We have to give voice to those that are not being listened to, because we have to begin ourselves opening up to listening to others and to having a dialogue, an epistemological dialogue with them. But then we have to start giving voice to those voices that are not listened to in society. We need to widen and to strengthen networks, both at the local, at the national, and at the international level. And since we are part of the educational system, we need to also embrace particularly Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which has to do with equity and quality of education at all levels of education, not only at the university level, because the university is the consequence of a pipeline that begins with kindergarten education. So we have to have a say there in equity of education. And also we have to play a very, very strong role in lifelong learning opportunities for all, which is also a part of SDG 4. This includes overcoming several barriers, as we very well know. It's a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts involve a struggle against other structures that present barriers to change. And some of these that I will mention are the diversification of students and staff, both socioeconomic and cultural diversification. We need to have the possibility of epistemological dialogue within our own walls. We need to transform the silo-like university structures that we very well know. We need also to modify this mindset that derives from the silos and that correspond with a disciplinary culture within most academies. Also, we lack incentives for inter and transdisciplinary research and for publishing outside the accepted and traditional research outlets. So we need to change that. We need to change these incentives. We need to build incentives for inter and transdisciplinary research. There is also a lack of flexibility for inter and transdisciplinary teaching mechanisms. Our structures actually do not allow for having, for example, several teachers from different disciplines teaching in the same subject matter, no? And it's always a struggle with our administrative structures to be able to allow for these transformations, but we need to do that. Also, we have non-democratic structures that limit the participation of staff and students and limit their say in the life of the university in general and in the choice of priorities and of projects. Also, we are sometimes very limited by accreditation criteria that do not recognize or even penalize needed transformations. And of course, with ranking criteria that sometimes lead decisions, not all the time, but when they lead decisions, they are a particular problem that we need to struggle against. The most important barrier to overcome, I believe, and this is the last thing that I will say, is an ethical one, because I think that all our higher education institutions need to make very explicit, or if they don't have them, to define very clear principles that underline the commitment of the institution to human rights, to social justice, and to sustainability. At least those. And these have to be made explicit and have to be made clear. And there has to be a corresponding epistemological watchfulness on the part of the university community as a whole of the congruence of the institutional and the academic decisions with these principles. And that is all that I have to say, and I am open to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for those very enlightening and very nuanced outlook to decolonizing knowledge, with such relevant points that you made about the way that the approach to addressing societal challenges today needs to be changed. We need to change. There needs to be a transformative change in that approach to solving problems. The inequities, discrimination, and racism, apart from and human mobility that have been exacerbated due to COVID-19, and how universities need and higher education institutions need to have a responsive approach to deal in their pedagogy, in their research, and going ahead, even in terms of outreach. As you pointed out, it is so important that the university addresses all sectors of society in addressing these problems. So thank you so much. And I'd like to point out that the final point that you made about ethics and defining those ethical principles are really the root and the building blocks for anything else that the university and the higher education institutions do. So that's very, very important. And thank you for those words. We hope you can continue the discussion in the Q&A. So we'll move on to our next speaker now. I will call upon Professor Openjuru and just see if he has his connectivity. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next speaker. Professor Openjuru? Okay. Because yes, he's not there. Okay, so we'll move on to the next speaker. We have with us our fourth speaker, Karen Villanueva. She currently holds the portfolio of Supervisor of Programming at the Tkaronto Center for Learning and Development for the past 6 years through her community development practice. Karen integrates her passion for popular education, activism, and visual arts to support immigrant and newcomer populations living in underserved communities in Tkaronto. Welcome, Karen. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Niharika, and thank you so much to everyone who has already shared their insights about higher education. I feel that every time I come to a congress or a conference, I'm always taking notes, learning something new from everyone. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. All right, let me just share my screen so that you can all see the beautiful pictures that I put together for you. So let me just start with the title of this talk, which is Weaving a Web of Knowledge for Change. And so the reason why I went with Weaving a Wave of Knowledge is because we're really grounded in Indigenous teachings through the work that we do at the Center of Learning and Development. And one of the ways to really integrate Indigenous knowledge into our practice is to remind ourselves of the multiple teachings of our ancestors. And so it's also good for us to recognize the land that we stand on. And so I wanted to honor Tkaronto, which is the land where we are right now, our hub. And so start off with a very good and warming story about grandmother spider. So spiders, for majority of us and majority of our cultures, spiders are a scary insect that, you know, comes roaming around our rooms, our beds, in the corners. And we don't want to see them. We don't want to interact with them. But in the Indigenous culture, specifically the Anishinaabe culture, spiders are seen as leaders, and spiders actually hold a lot of knowledge. And so similarly to grandmothers, they bring people together. And so they usually, of course, they're weaving all the time. That's their job. That's how they catch their prey. And so it's the same for us to think about how we translate that into higher education, into community development. How can we build those networks? How can we build those connections? How can we be ourselves those leaders that bring different sectors together? So I love how Sylvia was bringing out, approaches in terms of education, research, and outreach, because that's what grandmother spider really does. If you probably think about your own grandmother, everyone really gathers around them, right? They're the ones that bring family together. And so that's the idea that I wanted to bring up. And this is the work of actually one of my good friends, Niall Johnson, who's an Anishinaabe Indigenous artist here in the city. And so I encourage you to, again, connect with your ancestors, and of course Indigenous cultures wherever you are, to ground your knowledge in that location. So this is us. Moving on to who are the partners, who makes that web here in the Tkaronto hub. And so my organization is Center of Learning and Development, but also we work, of course, with the University of Toronto that has multiple campuses, and with the Ontario Council for International Cooperation, which is a compilation of different organizations that work in international development. And so we are the ones that really started off this hub, and we had multiple representatives at the KFORC mentorship that Rajesh and Bud held in Bogota in 2009 and 19. And so this is the group of mentors that were trained up and from the different organizations and institutions. So it was a balance between community organizations and universities, right? And so our field of study was really, okay, we're talking a lot about higher education. We're talking a lot about, making education accessible, but what does that actually mean in practice? And which is the population that we can target here in Toronto? And if you know anything about Toronto, is that we're very multicultural. We host a lot of immigrants and newcomers. And so that's the population that we generally work with. And this is the group of beautiful women that I have the privilege to work with for this specific project. And so they're all from different countries. Here you can see at least 10 different countries represented. So it's great to bring in different kinds of knowledge, different backgrounds, different languages. And the idea is, how do we actually teach or share or co-create community-based participatory action research as part of the Immigrant Women Integration Program, which is a community development program that we host at the Center of Learning and Development. And so really what we realized is that through this field study, there are conditions for teaching and learning, and these apply to all of us. And the first one was really human and capital resources. So making sure that we have not only a space, a physical space, but also rooted community members that want to engage in research, and specifically in community-based research, as well as professors and academics who are committed to contributing to community development and community building. It takes a village was the second thing that we realized, right? That, research is not a one person's job. And so that really community-based research is all about that community and bringing people together. And so that's why this first picture that you see here at the very top is actually at the University of Toronto. And some of the professors from the university are there. Some of us that work in community development are there, along with our program participants. And then the bottom two pictures are of our program participants themselves engaging with other community members. So it's a really good way to really show you how everything comes together. And well, of course, programmatic cohesiveness, flexibility, and freedom. So as much as we can plan, and of course, if you work at a university and in academia, you probably love organizing and planning. But community is messy and community is very fluid, right? And so understanding also the flow of community and being flexible in terms of, what are the expectations that we have and what are the expectations that community members have of us is extremely important. And then the last thing that we learned was trust. So that trust is really built through relationship. And so that's one of the main things that we learned, that in order for us to actually even talk about, research or social issues, there has to be trust and there has to be that comfort level and that safety to be able to open up about what is it that community members really care about. So what did we do? We actually created a curriculum along with program participants so that we can have a course, a community-based research course that is taught in community by community members in partnership with universities. And so these are some of the topics. I'm of course not going to read them all, but these are some of the topics from last year. So mental health of immigrant families during COVID-19, how can seniors, the elderly and people with disabilities overcome depression and isolation during the pandemic. So there's multiple topics of issues that the immigrant women themselves identified in their own communities. And they said, you know what, this is what we care about. This is what we're seeing in our communities. And so we want to research this specific topic. And so after that, of course, they went through a stakeholder analysis. So then who is it in my community that can tell me a little bit about this topic? And so they went out into their communities, figuring out, okay, who are the key stakeholders? This partnership with the University of Toronto also led them to go to and do a library research workshop and use the university resources that they generally don't have access to. I'm not sure in any other countries, but in Toronto, of course, universities are almost like these sacred places where, community members see as impossible or sometimes very guarded to access. And so the idea was to make these facilities accessible to them. And so they were able to come in and they were able to use what the university offers in order to further their research. And of course, cooperative learning. And so we looked into, what are your strengths? What is your knowledge? What do you bring to the table? How do you think about this topic in your country and in your history and in your lived experience? And can you bring that into the work, right? And so it was a lot of self-reflection and a lot of going into their own emotional intelligence and how to bring that into the research. And then we did the traditional methodologies of interview, surveys, and participant observation. But guess what? Through the KFORC consortium and the trainings that we took through the UNESCO chair, we were able to also offer alternative artistic methodologies for data collection. And so we brought in artists from different fields. We brought photographers and visual artists that would do workshops with the trainees and with the participants, and they got to, again, practically implement a lot of these methodologies in their research. So they also did drama, they did social cartography, they did collaging. So a lot of the very applied and artistic methodologies that are out there. Muralism was also part of it. And then, of course, they used a lot of those methodologies to start collecting their data into their own communities. And of course, accessing a lot of spaces that they generally wouldn't have had access to. So the fact that the university was backing them up as community members and community researchers really gave them this sense of belonging and authority almost of, you know what, I belong in this space and I'm gonna be able to ask or do activities with folks that I generally wouldn't have had the opportunity to do so. So then, of course, I think for all of us that have done research in the past, the data analysis is one of the hardest steps of research, but we really, again, try to build into the skills that participants already have and their own knowledge of research. A lot of these women that immigrate to Canada and to Toronto, they have their PhDs, they have their masters from back home. So academia and research is not new to them, but it's really more about how is it that they can apply those skills in a Canadian context, but also how are we valuing the knowledge that they're bringing in, right? And so, of course, they prepare for presentations once they had all their data analyzed, and they went to UFT to present in front of, you know, multiple classes of students and interacting with students there. The students were so engaged, asking them questions. And of course, they also looked for other ways to share their knowledge and their experience through this research. So they've been to, you know, local news channels to share about their topics. This bottom right picture is of one of our trainees who was in local news sharing about gender-based violence in immigrant women in Toronto. And so just to give you examples of the things they've been able to do with their research. And then, of course, what have been some of the outcomes of this project? And so, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we created a community-based participatory action research curriculum that we've integrated into our program and has been offered virtually as well through the last year. And we also host a community-based research summer institute in which we invite international partners, multiple stakeholders to attend and take some of the intensive classes that we also host. And then some of the participants from the community that have taken the course are actually the facilitators of a lot of those workshops. So it's how do they themselves see their own selves as researchers, and how are they provided with the spaces to share their own knowledge. That's really the end of my presentation. My contact information is here. And again, these are the organizations that make up our hub. Please feel free to add me to social media, LinkedIn, or contact me by email if you have any questions. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Karen, that was wonderful. I loved the analogy that you started with the grandmother spider. and how you then went on to discuss your field study. And the whole process of it is just so unique, and so the fact that from curriculum building, where it was the immigrant women who actually chose the questions and then they were the center point and the leaders for the field study, and the cooperative learning aspect of it, as well as the interesting methodologies that you adopted, and finally the analysis and the sharing of the findings and the successful outcomes of it is so refreshing and so reassuring in a sense. And we hope to hear more about your endeavors. We're going to now take forward the question and answer round, because I don't see Professor Openjuru yet. So we're going to take forward some of the questions now. There are I can actually see 3 questions here. And also I am aware that Dr. Schmelkes has to leave early as well. So I will just read out the questions, and then we can get responses from the speakers. So the first question that is from Francisco Paulo from Brazil, who I'm just going to read the second part of his question, which is what he's refined it to say, that although Dr. Sylvia has largely answered my question, how to convince the rich and the privileged, the materialists and the greedy, the high castes and the hierarchies, that change must be processed by them and the wealth must be distributed to seek equal life support. Should I go question wise, or should I just read out all of them and then maybe you can just respond to? I'll just read out all of them. The second question is by Madam Juliet, who says that that's for Dr. Tandon, that how do you establish the difference, if any, between decolonization and decoloniality? And the final one is to Madam Sylvia again. Why do you differentiate the project's interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary actions, and are they different actions?
Should I begin with my reply to the 2 questions that are directed towards me? Okay, well, regarding the first question, Francisco Paulo, I don't think there's only one way of doing things. I think that we have to combat this problem by multiple ways, by multiple vehicles. And I think that one of the things that the university does is to form the new generations. And some of these people that are being formed, actually disproportionately so, come from the higher echelons of society. So I think that the emphasis on forming them so that they are really, on educating them so that they really reach this profound understanding of the problems. They are indignated by the problems, and they have the experience of having some part in contributing to transform some of these problems together with the communities that suffer them. I really believe that that can lead to what we call the metanoia, or sort of a conversion, a new outlook on the world that will form them for the future, ethically for the future, that in such a way that their decisions will have to be taken not the way the previous generation took them. So I think there we have a large thing to do, a large amount of things to do. I also think that there are a few of these people that you mentioned that can be convinced. They are very, very few. It's actually the best way is that has been tested historically is not to convince them, because they don't leave their privileges and their interests remain. But anyway, there's still the possibility, because people are free, they have a free will, and they can change. So I still think we have to do an effort, make an effort to convince them. But well, also history, I think, has shown us that it is actually the social movements that transform the world. So hopefully these social movements are not violent social movements, and there are many ways of making social movements that are not violent, as so many people have taught us. But that is one of the reasons why we have to partner our universities with social movements, with social organizations, with civil organizations, with institutions, and with processes of transformation that are going on outside. So I don't think these are all of the ways that we should make our effort in, but some of them, and I don't think there's only one way, but there are synergies between the ways we choose to deal with this problem. And I think it's one of the biggest problems that we have, and I think one of the examples of this problem is the fact that that we have not reached the goals for climate change, no? That we have that the same people that are in a position of power have agreed to, and we have not been able to reach them. So I think this is an example of why conviction is not necessarily the best way to go about it. Well, that's my reply to the first one, but I think there was a second one for Rajesh.
Dr. Tandon, there's a question for you, so I'll just read it out. Thank you, Madam Sylvia, for those answers. You've certainly answered the questions addressed to you. Dr. Tandon, the question to you was that how do you establish the difference, if any, between decolonization and decoloniality?
Basically, colonization as a historical reality with European occupation of the subordinate states in order to extract resources and even human capital, the sort of the experience of the slave labor. Even though forms of formal colonial rules have been somewhat altered, and we have what can be called independent countries, they have inherited, because of the colonial occupation, they have inherited many aspects of the colony, of the colonial powers in the colonies. These include financial systems, these include administrative structures, these include use of language and culture, and also the system of education. Even the formal system of primary, secondary education is a replica in many ways when it began after the colonial period was over of the colonizing powers. I look at the issue of decoloniality as an exercise in critically questioning the continued relevance of those frameworks, institutional designs, and templates which those designs carry. It is possible, as Sylvia just said a few minutes ago, that you can reach similar purposes, achieve similar purposes through multiple routes. And even the form of democracy that we are currently propagating around the world does not necessarily have to have the Westminster or the American model, because the conditions under which those institutions of democracy came there are not necessarily replicated in the context. The latest casualty in this effort to hoist democracy is in our neighborhood in Afghanistan. And the formal experiment of creating a democratic regime, which was supposedly elected and legitimized by the citizens, has met its nemesis just 3 weeks ago. So if you look at the academic institutions, if you look at the structures of those institutions, if you look at the disciplines, the silos that Sylvia was talking about of the disciplines, if you even look at the syllabus that currently is taught, it is not something which has arisen or emerged from the local practice. And in some very disturbing ways, that syllabus looks uniform around the world. as if there is only one body of knowledge in the domain of any of those disciplines. Part of the problem of silos and disciplines, which we are trying to address through the phrase transdisciplinarity, is because it has viewed human existence and human activity from narrow and increasingly narrower lens. We seem to value a form of narrow specialization. So now you have doctors who examine the second toe of the left foot. But if a toe on the right foot is a problem, that doctor cannot examine. But holistic medicine, indigenous systems of medicine, organic medicine, that system always integrated body, mind, and soul. And it had a spiritual dimension, and it looked at, if you had a stomach problem, it looked at it potentially arising from a combination of causes, including stress. So this perspective is very different, and it is a imposition of a uniform framework and a uniform standard, a uniform syllabus, a uniform pedagogy, which is reinforcing that original colonial model of higher education. And as we have heard today, and there are many experiments and efforts to resist this in many parts of the world, and I hope this resistance will continue, because the survival of the planet and its people depends on diversity of models of learning and epistemologies to focus on that. I particularly like the phrase that Sylvia used about subversive universities. And I think that's what this process is all about. It is not just a superficial rejection of language or superficial rejection of an author or a point of view. It is to look very in an embedded way from the bottom up, from the roots of our societies, and select ways of learning and building expertise and making those expertise accountable to society. The ethical dimension of that expertise has to be societally valued, not just personally propagated. So I think those are the practices in which we can look at some efforts that are going on around the world, and all of you are very much at the forefront of it. Thank you.
Some very powerful words, Dr. Tandon and Dr. Schmelkes as well. Madam Julieta, would you like to comment or maybe ask a follow-up question or make a follow-up comment on the same, on the question or another one? Okay. What about, sorry, you're on mute?
After.
Okay. What about Karen? Would you like to, do you have some thoughts that you might want to share, or any questions that you might want to put on the floor for further discussion?
Well, I was thinking about what Sylvia said earlier, and I completely agree with how do we engage with the privilege layers and engage them in the process of decolonization and integration of knowledge, etc. And so one of the things that I was thinking about too, that at least, well, as you know, Toronto is perceived globally as, you know, a very wealthy city, and of course very developed. And so for folks to actually come to understand that Toronto has pockets of poverty and that there are a lot of excluded communities in the global north is a little bit of a shock. And even talking about it, I shiver, because there's so, much inequality in the city. And so you see the indigenous communities, the Black community, and a lot of minorities being affected by, you know, the privilege and the rich, and how their approach to holding on to knowledge. And, you know, especially when it comes to this concept of education in universities and academia. And so really bringing about open access, as Rajesh was mentioning, making resources available is somewhat of a challenge, but I think that it starts also with these vulnerable communities taking up a space in a lot of these spaces and positions and institutions. And so it's been hard for a lot of institutions to change up, you know, their mindset in terms of decolonizing, you know, the ways and practices in which they carry out their practices. But at the same time, we've seen changes. So for example, one of the universities here that was named after one of the main oppressors under colonialism, Ryerson, has just announced that they're going to change the university's name, which is huge. And indigenous communities have been fighting for that for years. And so it's that advocacy piece from these vulnerable communities as well that have been so resilient and have kept fighting for their voices to be heard. And now finally that a lot of even researchers have brought up you know, abuses to indigenous communities, and anthropologists that have discovered, unfortunately, you know, a lot of children that were abused and held captive through residential schools. So a lot of, again, collaboration between academia and these communities has brought to light a lot of the truth about colonialism. And so it has ignited a lot of change in universities. And so I encourage everyone, again, one of the main ways to decolonize the spaces that we're in is by allowing for these communities to take part, but also collaborating in making their voices heard, but also so that they can take leadership in these positions. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thank you so much for those insights. And really to add to that, as the speakers have already stated before, that, you know, using Dr. Tandon's words, the idea that the ethical dimension has to be societally valued, that ethical dimension, you know, really is the essence of you know, any such collaborative effort that Karen, you were talking about. And therefore the purpose of higher education, the purpose of education really needs to be the center, and the people have to be at the center of decolonizing knowledge. So with that, you know, I'm going to now call upon Madam Julieta to, yes, Dr. Schmelkes.
There was another question that I didn't answer, which has to do with the difference between inter and transdisciplinarity. And yes, I think it's important. I think there are different views about this, but at least I can explain what my view is. And I think against the disciplinary view of the world, there are like 3 levels, and I think the 3 are important. But one goes to there are of different depths. The first is the multidisciplinarity or the multidiscipline approach, which has to do with an additive model. No, each discipline adds from its own discipline to the understanding of a problem, or to its solution, or to the design of the solution. But it's an additive model. The interdisciplinary model is more like a synergical model where the disciplines dialogue, and from this dialogue something new comes out. Different to the different disciplines, no? So that is interdisciplinarity, but it is still a question of disciplines stemming from scientific knowledge. You know? And transdisciplinarity then is the step, the very important qualitative step to including other ways of knowing and to including other actors that are not necessarily academics. You know? So, and that is what makes it even richer, no? Because you have an interdisciplinary approach, but you also have the views of other types of knowledge, that practical knowledge and knowledge that comes from traditional knowledge and what Professor Tandon was saying. But also you have the participation of those who are suffering the consequences of the problems in designing the solution to those problems, and that is transdisciplinarity. That is what I think what we're talking about here in this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for that clarification. Very important. Thank you. So I don't see any other questions now in the chat box. So I'm going to now ask Madam Julieta to give the closing remarks and to close the session. I can't see Madam Julieta. I think she might have gotten disconnected. I'll just wait for a second. Yes, there she is again, ma'am. So just to introduce the participants, the viewers who are listening and who are part of this session that we have with us. Madam Julieta Heder, who is the president of the Third World Transdisciplinarity Congress. So
Okay.
The floor is yours, ma'am.
Ok, muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en español, Spanish. Disculpen porque no puedo hablar el inglés, entiendo, pero no puedo hablar en inglés. Agradecemos el Tercer Congreso Mundial de Transdisciplinariedad. Agradece la presencia de Rajesh, Tandon, de todos los participantes, de Sylvia, de Karen, de Niharika en este evento, y creo que se han tocado algunos puntos que yo voy a revisar un poco para colocar en diálogo con las otras sesiones, ¿no? Que siempre es lo que hago, pues. Después, en YouTube, ustedes pueden traducir a 112 lenguas lo que estoy hablando. YouTube traduce, translate, en 112 lenguas lo que estoy hablando en español. El primer punto que yo pregunté a Rajesh es la diferencia, y él explicó bien, la diferencia entre descolonización y decolonialidad. Porque en el Congreso hay una ambigüedad de los dos conceptos. Y él explicó bien, descolonización es un proceso de liberación de los países, ¿no? De África, de América, de Asia, de los países colonizados. Entonces se descolonizan. Y a posteriori, la decolonialidad es un proceso de una epistemología, una búsqueda de epistemología para liberar los procesos cognitivos. Pero por eso la sesión de esta semana se llama Ciencia Open Science, ciencia abierta. Quiere decir, ciencia abierta a outros processos cognitivos, como planteou um pouco Karen, não? Retomando processos cognitivos das culturas ancestrais. E nesse sentido é que a decolonialidade dá lugar, dentro da Open Science, dá lugar a decolonialidade para que entrem outros processos cognitivos, não só do Ocidente, sino de África, de América e de China, de Asia y de otros países. Ese es un punto muy importante en el Congreso. El segundo punto importante que tocó Silvia se relaciona con la diferencia, que también en el Congreso siempre queda como un punto importante, la diferencia entre interdisciplinariedad, primero multidisciplinariedad, interdisciplinariedad y transdisciplinariedad. Creemos que dentro del Congreso la discusión es continua, o sea, la explicación es continua porque hay una búsqueda de diferenciar como proceso cognitivo, como epistemologías, la multidisciplinariedad, la interdisciplinariedad y la transdisciplinariedad. que una gran diferencia es que la transdisciplinaridad está vinculada a la complejidad. Va más allá, como decía Silvia, de la interdisciplinaridad. Es un proceso más complejo. Y ese proceso, Silvia, en términos de la Ibero y de otras instituciones, es importante que ese proceso se introduzca, se coloque en las instituciones, en las universidades, ¿no? O sea, que las universidades asuman la science, open science, y que asuman la articulación con otros procesos cognitivos, ¿no? de los continentes. Y eso yo creo que implicaría un cambio curricular muy importante a nivel de los procesos educativos mundiales. Entonces, agradecemos mucho la presencia de ustedes. El Congreso sigue hasta mediados de octubre y esperamos continuar en diálogo. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Julieta, for those words.